on the exact night my heart stopped beating on a surgical table. My biological mother was standing at the hospital's front desk, screaming at the nurses to rip out my IVs and discharge me. Not because she was terrified for my life, but because she needed a full 8 hours of sleep to set up the mimosa bar for my older sister's baby shower the next morning. My name is Elena Monroe, and I am 26 years old. It was 2 o'clock on a Thursday morning when the pain hit me like a freight train. I had been feeling off all evening, a dull ache in my lower right side that I kept dismissing as bad takeout. But at 2 in the morning, that dull ache morphed into a visceral, blinding agony that forced me to my hands and knees. I could not stand. I could barely pull oxygen into my lungs. I was sweating completely through my shirt, violently shaking, gripping the edge of my bathroom sink, and staring at my own pale reflection like I was watching a stranger actively dying. I dragged myself across the cold bathroom tiles, grabbed my phone, and called my mother. It rang straight to voicemail. I called my father. Voicemail. I kept dialing, back and forth, my hands trembling so violently, I kept dropping the phone. By the time I dialed for the 17th time, I was lying flat on my back on the kitchen floor, the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the same automated greeting I had heard my entire life. I left 3 messages. By the third one, my vision was going black around the edges, and I was sobbing so hard the words barely formed. Dad, I choked out into the empty void of the answering machine. I think I am dying. Please come. Nobody came. I only know what happened next because the paramedics reconstructed it for me later. My neighbor, Mrs. Patton, a retired woman in her 60s who barely knew my name, heard me hit the floor through the thin apartment wall. She called 911 when she heard the absolute, terrifying silence that followed my collapse. By the time the ambulance crew kicked in my front door, I was barely conscious. They told me later that my appendix had ruptured. They said another 30 minutes on that kitchen floor, and the outcome would have been final. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and disjointed voices. Once I hit the emergency room, the world simply dissolved. I was rushed into surgery, my body failing under the toxicity of the infection. On the operating table, I flatlined. My heart stopped beating for 90 seconds. There was no white light. There were no voices of long-departed relatives beckoning me forward. There was only a deep, profound, and absolute silence, a void so heavy it felt like it had mass. And then, suddenly, the noise returned. It was a violent, jarring intrusion. The shrill, rhythmic beeping of machines, the panicked shouting of the surgical team, and the physical agony of chest compressions that felt like they were shattering my ribs one by one. I was being dragged back into a body that had already decided to quit. When I finally regained consciousness in the recovery room, the world was gray and muffled. A nurse was sitting beside me, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of my monitors. I was groggy. My throat felt like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper, but I managed to whisper a question. I asked if my parents had arrived. The nurse looked at me with an expression I know I will carry to my own grave. It wasn't pity. Pity implies there is a hope for a better outcome. It was the look of a witness who had just seen something morally repugnant. She told me that my emergency contacts had been notified and that someone had indeed shown up at the hospital. But before she could finish that sentence, the door creaked open, and Dr. Reeves, my surgeon, walked in. He was a man with tired, heavy eyes and a steady, measured voice. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. He didn't offer a routine post-surgery update. The way he positioned himself told me he was bracing for a collision. "Elena," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You had a very serious night. We almost lost you." I nodded slowly. I knew. I had been in the silence. Then, he leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "A woman claiming to be your mother came to this hospital tonight. She demanded that we discharge you immediately." I stared at him, my mind unable to process the cruelty of the statement. I had just flatlined on his table hours ago. "She was told that was impossible, given your critical condition," Dr. Reeves continued, his jaw tightening. "She became argumentative with the staff in the hallway. She told them her other daughter had a baby shower in the morning, and the entire family was expected to be home to prepare. I felt the room tilt. The man who had just saved my life looked toward the door, then back at me. "But then," he whispered, "the man who paid your bill arrived." Before Dr. Reeves could finish his sentence, the heavy wooden door to my room slowly pushed open. A man stepped inside. I had never seen him before in my life. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with broad shoulders, weathered skin, and calloused hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime building things. He wore a faded canvas jacket and carried the quiet, grounded presence of a seasoned firefighter or a blue-collar worker. The exact kind of steady, dependable father figure I had spent 26 years wishing for but never had. Dr. Reeves stood up, offered the man a deeply respectful nod, and quietly excused himself from the room, leaving the two of us alone. I instinctively pulled my thin hospital blanket up to my chin. "Who are you?" I croaked, my voice barely working. He sat down in the chair Dr. Reeves had just vacated and gently folded his hands in his lap. "My name is Arthur," he said, his tone incredibly soft. "Arthur Hayes." Arthur told me he had been visiting his own brother on the cardiac floor when he came down to the lobby for a cup of coffee. That was when he heard the screaming. He stood 20 feet away and watched my mother, a woman dressed in an immaculate, expensive cashmere coat, berating a triage nurse. Arthur did not sugarcoat it. He quoted her exact words to me. "Madison's baby shower is at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. I do not have time for Elena's theatrics. Give me the forms to sign her out against medical advice." The nurses firmly refused, explaining that pulling me out of the intensive care unit would literally kill me. My mother's response? She rolled her eyes, loudly complained about the hospital's incompetence, asked if they were going to validate her parking ticket, and then walked out the sliding glass doors into the night. Arthur said he watched her taillights disappear. He told me he felt a sickening twist in his gut that he simply could not ignore. He walked straight up to the billing desk and quietly asked the head nurse what my situation was. Due to privacy laws, they could not tell him the medical details. But he gleaned enough. He saw that I had absolutely no family waiting for me. Worse, he overheard that my insurance had a critical coverage gap. Without a family member to sign as a financial guarantor, my continued post-operative care would be immediately interrupted by administrative holds. So Arthur pulled out his wallet. A complete stranger handed over his credit card and paid the massive hospital deposit out of his own pocket, just so the medical staff could keep me alive without the billing department getting in the way. I stared at this man. 5 minutes ago, I did not even know his last name. Now, he was sitting in the dim light of my hospital room, explaining how he had quietly stepped into the abyss to save me while my own flesh and blood abandoned me for a party aesthetic. I broke. It was not a delicate, quiet cry. It was an ugly, guttural, chest-heaving sob that tore out of a dark place I had kept padlocked for decades. Arthur did not try to shush me. He did not offer toxic positivity or empty platitudes about how everything happens for a reason. He did not leave the room because my emotions were too messy. He just sat there in the chair in absolute silence, holding space for my grief, which was the most profoundly paternal thing anyone had ever done for me. They finally showed up late the next afternoon. There was no rushing through the door, no frantic checking of my vitals, and absolutely no tears. Margaret walked in first, holding an iced matcha latte in one hand and her designer handbag in the other. She did not even look at the heart monitor or the IV tubes feeding antibiotics into my bruised arms. She stopped at the foot of my bed, sighed heavily, and delivered her opening line. My phone was on silent. "Elena, what on earth possessed you to call 17 times?" I stared at her. I had literally flatlined, and her primary concern was the annoyance of clearing her notification screen. "You know how stressed I was about setting up Madison's baby shower," she continued, taking a casual sip of her drink. "We barely got the balloon arch up in time because I had to deal with the hospital calling me at ungodly hours. Madison had a beautiful morning, by the way. You really missed out, but I suppose you always have a knack for ruining the timing of family events. Gaslighting is a fascinating weapon." A true narcissist will stand over your hospital bed, look at your near corpse, and somehow convince themselves that they are the victim of your medical emergency. I shifted my gaze to my father. He stood by the door, his arms tightly crossed over his chest. He did not step closer. He did not ask how I was feeling. He just stood there, nodding along to Margaret's twisted narrative like a well-trained enabler. For 26 years, I had made excuses for his silence, telling myself he was just a quiet man. Lying in that hospital bed, the brutal truth finally snapped into focus. His silence was not passivity. It was complicity. He was a co-conspirator in my abuse. Then, Margaret noticed the vibrant bouquet of flowers sitting on the drab hospital windowsill. Arthur had left them before returning upstairs to his brother. She walked over, inspecting the card with a look of deep suspicion. "Who is Arthur?" she demanded, turning back to me with a sharp glare. "Why is a complete stranger buying you flowers and paying bills? That is incredibly odd, Elena. It makes our family look incompetent. Who involves a stranger in private family business?" She was not thankful that a man had saved my life. She was furious that a stranger had witnessed her monstrousness. They stayed for exactly 40 minutes. Margaret talked entirely about Madison's gifts, the catering, and how exhausted she was from playing the perfect hostess. She complained about the hospital parking fees. As I laid there, listening to the woman who gave birth to me prioritize a mimosa bar over my beating heart, the heavy, suffocating fog I had lived in for 2 decades suddenly evaporated. I looked at the 2 people in the room, and I did not see my parents anymore. I saw exactly what Arthur had seen from 20 feet away, 2 empty, toxic shells who only valued me when I was convenient. The realization was not painful. It was profoundly, terrifyingly liberating. "Margaret," I said, abruptly cutting off her complaint about the hospital cafeteria's terrible coffee. My voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the kind of absolute, chilling finality that makes the air turn to ice. Both of them stopped talking and looked at me. "Dying on that surgical table taught me one very clear lesson," I told her, my eyes locked directly onto hers without a single trace of tears. "Blood does not make a family, it just creates hostages. And I am officially done paying the ransom." Margaret's jaw literally dropped. For the first time in 26 years, the great manipulator was completely speechless. "You both can leave now," I said, pointing my bruised, ivy-taped finger toward the heavy wooden door. "I am sure Madison's party still has trash that needs to be cleaned up." They left. They did not argue. Predators always retreat the exact second they realize the prey is no longer afraid. Before I was discharged 3 days later, Arthur visited me one last time, bringing his wife, Patricia. She was a warm, vibrant woman who sat on the edge of my bed, gently held my bruised hand, and said the words that fundamentally changed my life. "You have people in this world, sweetheart. You just haven't met all of them yet." I found out later from the nursing staff that Arthur had also quietly filed a formal report with the hospital's patient advocacy board regarding my mother's attempt to pull me out of the intensive care unit. He documented her negligence so perfectly that if anything ever went wrong, there was an airtight legal record. He did not tell me he did it. He was just the kind of man who did the right thing in the dark. I am fully recovered now. Arthur and Patricia are my family, my real family. The kind defined by presence and action, not by blood and toxic obligation. The fog has finally lifted on who my biological parents always were versus who I desperately needed them to be. If this story reached you today, I want you to know something. The people who show up for you in your darkest moments, even quietly, even without being asked, even if they are complete strangers, are the ones who show you what love is actually supposed to look like. Sometimes, nearly losing your life is the exact thing you need to realize whose hands were never holding you to begin with. This story is dedicated to every person who has ever called for help and heard silence. You are not forgotten. Hit that subscribe button, share your own survival story in the comments, and become part of a community that believes the truth deserves to be heard.